Good evening. I'm Jonathan Feldstein. I'm the president of the Genesis 123 Foundation and really privileged to host today's webinar, the Inspiration from Zion webinar, the implications of the U.S. presidential election on the war against Hamas. I want to just give a quick background for anyone who's not familiar. Genesis 123 Foundation is a U.S. nonprofit whose mission is to build bridges between Jews and Christians with Israel, and we say in ways that are new, unique, and meaningful. And this is not meant to be a commercial promotion. You can go and check out our programs at genesis123.co. But this webinar podcast series, where I have the distinction of being the only Orthodox Jewish host of a weekly podcast about Israel on the Charisma Podcast Network, gives you an idea of some of the uniqueness that we try to jump in the sense of building bridges between Jews and Christians. And because we're coming from different perspectives, we always approach this with mutual respect, but from our respective traditions. I invite you to check out specifically now, because we are in the midst of a war still, the Genesis 123 Foundation Israel Emergency Campaign, also at genesis123.co. We received some great questions before the webinar, and I will do my best to get to them and weave them into the conversation. And anyone following here today is welcome to use the Q&A feature as well, and we will do our best to integrate those questions. Today, I'm really thrilled to have a very important topic, and it's going to become more important as the weeks and months pass, getting closer to November. Presidential campaign, as we know, is in full swing. The New Hampshire primary just took place and seems very clear that we're narrowing in on two candidates that probably will be determined sooner than later. And having a conversation tonight about what the implications are of the presidential campaign against Israel's war against Hamas. I have two really noted great colleagues and panelists with me today. John Haller is a lawyer, journalist, a teacher, and a pastor. As a lawyer, he has significant trial and business law experience, including complex commercial litigation, securities litigation, contracts, covenants, not to compete, banking, real estate, and white-collar criminal defense. At Fellowship Bible Chapel in Ohio, John has popular YouTube and Rumble channels discussing how Bible prophecy relates to current events, geopolitics, and specifically Israel. John has hosted me a number of times on his program, and I'm really thrilled to have you, John, here with us today as my guest.
Good to be
Jonathan Tobin is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and a senior contributor for The Federalist, as well as top columnist for Newsweek, Israel Hayom, and writing for many other publications. He is also the host of the JNS video and podcast series Top Story and Top Story Daily, which are both heard on all major audio platforms as well as on YouTube. Previous to this, he was the editor at Commentary magazine, as well as for weekly Jewish newspapers. He has won more than 60 awards for his commentary, art criticism, and other writings, and appears regularly on television, commenting on politics and foreign policy. John and Jonathan, I'm thrilled to have you. Welcome to Inspiration from Zion.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.
So today, I think it makes sense to begin with the elephant that's not quite in the room. We've got two parties. We've got two major contendants in the Republican Party, still vying for office for the nomination, and of course an incumbent Democratic president who we'll get to. And probably it's intuitive that most of this conversation is going to focus around President Biden and his administration, not just because he's the incumbent, but he's also running for re-election, and how he runs is going to be significant. But before that, I'd like to talk about the Republicans. And I'm wondering, and either of you jump in, this is going to be a very open conversation. Does it matter with Donald Trump and Nikki Haley as the two candidates, and Nikki Haley a solid number two in a campaign of two? Does it matter how they campaign in terms of Israel and how that relates to carrying out the war? And will it impact anything, even if the war goes on for some months past the November election?
Well, I would say the real no real differences between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley on Israel. They're both strong supporters of Israel. Nikki Haley, got her only foreign policy experience at the UN, where she was a strong supporter of, in the Trump administration and was a strong supporter of Israel. She has a lot of pro-Israel money and former establishment Republicans who are very supportive of Israel behind her. And Donald Trump, he has a record. It's not a question of what his leanings are. He has a record. And quite frankly, he was the most pro-Israel president we have ever had. So there's no debate within the Republicans on Israel, or at least not to any great extent. And I should add, we're sort of including Nikki Haley. She's still in the race. She's got the money to continue to be in the race for a while. So the putative notion that she could actually win must be respected in principle, but she is not going to be the nominee. Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee for president. There is about as little, short of an act of God, nothing will prevent him from winning the nomination. So, including Nikki Haley in that. Now, the only problem with Trump is that there are people within his circle, and I would most notably say Tucker Carlson, the former Fox News host. He's now has his own show on X, formerly known as Twitter. Tucker Carlson is no friend of Israel. He's been much more open about his hostility to Israel since he was booted off Fox last year. And I think it's reasonable for people to ask, does he have Trump's ear on Israel? But the truth is, I don't think that's so. He was close to Trump during the Trump presidency, and Trump did nothing that he wanted on the Middle East. He was opposed to Trump's, tough stand on Iran, never mind his pro-Israel policy. So it's not clear to me that Tucker Carlson has the juice within the circus that is the Trump inner circle to actually implement things. I think Trump likes him because he's a celebrity and because he sucks up to him like anybody else who's in Trump's inner circle. But so there is that element, people like Candace Owens. There is an element of the conservative commentariat that is hostile to Israel, bordering sometimes on anti-Semitism. But the overwhelming majority of Republicans, I think, the thing we have to understand, and this is a point to place it all in perspective, is that the two parties have basically swapped identities in the last 60 years on Israel. If we were, more than a half century ago, the Republicans were the party that was so-so on Israel, divided between sort of an establishment that was either hostile or indifferent, and a minority that was actively pro-Israel. The Democrats were the lockstep pro-Israel party. That's completely changed. Now the Republicans are the lockstep pro-Israel party. Almost no Republicans in office are anything but ardent supporters of Israel. Whereas the Democrats are now deeply divided. I mean, we'll get to the Democrats later, as you say. They're deeply divided about Israel, with a sort of an establishment pro-Israel faction that is nominally in charge, but all the juice, all the activism, all the energy is with an anti-Israel intersectional left.
Thank you, Jonathan. John, so there was something you were saying right before we started the program, and I don't remember what it was, but it kind of segues to where I wanted to pick up on this, on the point that Jonathan just made, regarding, does it matter how Nikki Haley and Trump, but Trump as candidate will be campaigning? But if there are people like Candace Owens, like Tucker Carlson, like other people to more the extreme right, is there a right wing of the Republican Party that Trump as candidate will need to listen to in some capacity, like Biden might have to vis-a-vis the extreme left in the Democratic Party?
My observation. So, look, I'm a conservative Christian evangelical, so that's my perspective. But I do live in the real world. So my observation, and I was on a podcast yesterday where this actually came up with a former IDF tank commander, and my observation is that there's a split on the right, if you want to call it the far right or whatever. Jonathan is right to point out Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson, who I think have been very clever in the way they have sort of shown their disdain for Israel's interest by not necessarily saying it overtly themselves, but by interviewing people who are clearly anti-Semitic and not really challenging them. As I think one commentator I heard said, that I don't know if they're anti-Semitic, but they sure spend a lot of time interviewing anti-Semitic this has been my observation too. So, and this is very concerning. So, my own observation of the Trump campaign thus far is that the Israel issue has not been front and center, even though there's a war. Trump did say, I think, after he won the New Hampshire primary yesterday, that well, I'll get Ukraine and Israel problems. I'll solve those really fast. But there was no specifics. So on what I would call the Tucker Carlson wing, and then there are people even further to the right of Tucker. They sort of take their America first ideas and it becomes America only. So they're not really concerned about it, And so there is, and even on some podcasts from the right, big Trump supporters, when October 7th happened, within a day, those podcasts were saying stuff like, oh, well, look, here we go with another war started by the neocons and Zionists.
Interesting.
And that was very, very troubling to me. So I think the way that Trump has approached this thus far is to be a bit ambiguous on the issue. Now, we know what he did. We know his track record. We know the move of the embassy to Israel, the declaration about the Golan Heights. But there were many in the Christian right, what you would call the Christian Zionist right, of which I would consider myself a part, that were concerned 4 years ago when Trump introduced his Vision for Peace plan, put together by his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. And that was rolled out just almost exactly 4 years ago. That clearly called for the creation of a Palestinian state. So I think in the background of support for Trump, that on the pro-Israel Christian right, there's a concern that the Palestinian state thing right now makes no sense at all. It just, I'm looking at it. I've talked to you about it. I've talked to a lot of people in Israel about it. It just does not make any sense. I don't see how anyone can think that it's a rational way to go. And so when I hear Trump say, I'll solve the problem, I don't know what he means by that.
Okay.
About a month ago.
Neither does he.
I know. I don't think he knows.
He's just saying he'll solve the problems. And
right.
Partly that's just Trump, if you don't mind me jumping in, that's partly just typical Trump, bravado. That's how he approaches everything. I'll make everything better. I can solve problems. I'm a problem solver. It's also an expression of his idea, well, I'm going to be strong in the Middle East. I'm going to reverse Biden's policies. And the sort of, as the Soviets would have said, the correlation of forces will be different. And he's probably right about that. And, it's also true. I think you made it interesting, sort of who has the power to sort of influence him, the way you set this up, Jonathan. And the truth is, nobody has the power to influence Donald Trump except Donald Trump. It's true in the last administration, Jared Kushner had a lot of juice and a lot of influence on a lot of things.
Juice. We need to.
Yes, to use the political term. Jared's not going to be part of the next administration, and conservatives on a lot of issues are happy about that. As to who will staff it, who knows? We don't know what this is pure conjecture. We're a long way from November, let alone a putative second Trump administration.
So by May, June, we're full swing into if not before, two candidates, two parties, Trump and Biden, and we're and very likely still some form of war going on here. Certainly, Israel's not withdrawn from Gaza completely, and that means if we're not withdrawn, that means we're still fighting people. How does that leave the campaign? Where's the Trump-Biden battle vis-a-vis Israel and the continuation of the war?
The interesting, there's kind of basic principles here. American elections are not, as a rule, generally decided or even deeply influenced by foreign policy. Because most Americans don't care about foreign policy.
Correct.
We live in a country that, our national defense is a function of oceans and continents, not narrow lines as Israel must face. And Americans don't speak foreign languages unless they grew up with a foreign language. They want to stay out. Now, to the extent that foreign policy will play a role in this election, it's not going to be between Trump and Biden who's more pro-Israel. Now, Trump may score some points if Biden winds up bowing a bit to his left wing, which to date he hasn't. We didn't get it. We haven't gotten into the whole dynamic within the Democratic Party because Biden is in a real bind. The left wing, activist wing of his party is very much against his policies of support of Israel. It's why he's been talking out of both sides of his mouth during the war, sticking, to his great credit, I might add, sticking to a position of support for Israel and support even for the principle of eradicating Hamas, but at the same time doing everything to try and hamstring Israel from prosecuting the war more vigorously, and trying to get it over with as soon as possible because it's causing him enormous political problems. There's a general revolt within his own administration. Everybody below the undersecretary level is basically an anti-Israel activist. That's Democratic staffers throughout his administration, in Congress, all the activist wing. And also, just to put it, not too fine a point on it, Michigan is up for grabs.
So that's what I was going to go, right.
Arab American voters who went out in droves for Biden against the pro-Israel Trump have been completely disillusioned with Biden's support for Israel. And it's not clear where he'll get that back. I mean, you sort of young left-wing voters, the woke, are adamantly opposed. As much as I think many in the pro-Israel community want Biden to do more and want Biden to stop pressuring Israel's government, he's under enormous pressure within his own party to back away from Israel, to abandon Israel, to make this go away.
Jonathan, when we did an interview recently together as part of a panel, and you used the phrase which you use now, speaking out of both sides of his mouth, and it's accurate and it's appropriate. But my question is, at what point is the speaking? Biden and Trump have a lot of similarities as far as saying things that they probably shouldn't or don't necessarily.
You mean they tend to
say,
fib? Huh? Yeah. They tend to fib.
Oh, yes. Fib or just say things that are silly. And so when Biden came out a few weeks ago and talked about Israel's indiscriminate bombing, he knew Israel wasn't indiscriminately bombing. It was I don't know if it was calculated or if it was stupid, but my question is, where do we see the speaking out of both sides of his mouth and affect policy? Because the one thing you didn't mention, for instance, is the U.S. has yet to do what Obama did, which is cut off supplies of weapons.
Absolutely. That is the key point. Right. They haven't done it.
At what point do we see speaking out of both sides of his mouth, but still sending the weapons that are needed and winking over at Netanyahu, even though we can't stand Netanyahu?
Somewhat to my surprise, and I'll admit I'm somewhat surprised. And listen, I was asked on another podcast recently, how do I grade Biden on Israel? And I said, if we were speaking before October 7th, I would have given him a D- or an F.
Okay.
After October 7th, I give him a C+. Because everything he did before October 7th set up October 7th in terms of strengthening Iran, undermining the Saudis, strengthening the Houthis, the whole deal, appeasing Hezbollah in Lebanon. Since October 7th, he has stuck to his principles, at least on the broad strokes, and he has not cut off the flow of arms to Israel, which is vitally important. We're speaking in January. We're over 110 days since the start of the war. To date, he hasn't cut off arms. I'm not clear that he's going to, and that, as I say, is greatly to his credit. I'm not sure that he will. If he does, Trump will pounce on him. That you can count on. But other than that, any foreign policy debate in the 2024 election is not going to be about Israel. It's going to be about Ukraine and the massive Biden commitment to Ukraine, which is broadly unpopular, certainly within the Republican Party, not
Right.
within the sort of the Republican establishment in Washington, but Republican voters do not think that spending another $150 billion a year on a war that truly is unwinnable and is a stalemated in Ukraine is a great idea.
Excellent. John, you were about to jump in?
Yeah, I would agree with him that, if Biden really feels that he's in trouble and has to play to his left, the anti-Israel left, Jonathan was right to note the state just north of where I live, Michigan, which has a huge Muslim Arab population, that that issue will come more to the forefront. Trump will pounce on that and say, we'll be strong. And the concern on the right is that, America is not strong. We've sent so much to Ukraine in terms of weapons and that type of thing. Now, some of it's all technology, but some of it's, shells and ammunition and weapons, and we're depleting ourselves and we're not replenishing it. And I think this is going to play out as well within Israel, that there's not going to be the weapons stock that's needed. For example, if Israel decides that it's necessary to open a front in Lebanon, this is a very, very difficult situation in which Israel finds itself right now. So I think on the right, most people that are pro-Israel will see the massive problems that are facing Israel. And to back up for a second, Jonathan is exactly right. Americans don't usually vote on foreign policy. I remember Ronald Reagan, of course, get the commies and take down the Soviet Union. And that sort of won the day. But, people like James Baker, I don't think were any friends of Israel in the foreign policy. So the foreign policy establishment has long been anti-Israel. So I see a synergy between the policies of Obama. I jokingly refer to the administration as the Biden administration, that this is the third Obama term, because it's the same people. It's the same people in the State Department that are doing the same things that they did during the first two Obama administrations. And I'm concerned that the foreign policy establishment, which is making policy that manifests itself on the ground, is clearly no friend of Israel or what Israel really needs. And so the question Israel's going to have is, do we need the American, at what point do we just break with the American support and take care of ourselves?
Okay.
Well,
and I know that's being discussed somewhat.
One thing, you're absolutely right about the foreign policy establishment in this country being hostile to Israel, or deeply critical at best, is sort of the Tom Friedman wing of the foreign policy establishment. The one thing we know, we don't know much about what a second Trump administration would be if we're going to sort of float, scenarios. The one thing we do know about it is that unlike the first Trump administration, in which sort of there were still a lot of establishment people, especially at the beginning, establishment Republicans taking, leadership roles. The next Trump administration will be, shall we say, more seriously conservative. It will be at war with the administrative state, and at war with the establishment in every respect, including the foreign policy establishment. So that is, the old Arabist wing Tucker Carlson may be trying to, and people of that ilk may be trying to, worm their way into some influence. I'm not sure whether they actually can. But the old foreign policy establishment, and even its sort of business wings, people like Rex Tillerson, and sort of the military version of that, like people like James Mattis, who had, cabinet roles at the beginning of the Trump administration, those kind of people are not getting jobs in the next Trump administration. As we've seen through all the plans that sort of the conservatives, people at Heritage and others who have been planning for what it will be when the Republicans next take power, those guys are out of luck.
Okay,
yeah, I think among what I would call sort of mega media, in the various Rumble and Telegram channels, there is a plan, and I think Heritage may be involved in this, is to really neuter the administrative state. I mean, because
absolutely, I've written about it myself. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they almost have to. I've advocated that they sort of take the administrative state and put them in big warehouses, pay them, get your salary, but here, put
Going
your
to
cell
be
phone in this
there's
bin.
going to be civil service reform. There's not going to be a powerful. I mean, the administrative state will be severely cut back in the next Republican
Right.
administration, because what happened during the first Trump administration was that as much as Trump got some things he wanted done, for all the talk about him being an authoritarian, he got very little done, largely because he was, he was hampered. He was largely obstructed by the people that work in the federal government.
Okay.
I'm now Democrats say these plans are signs of authoritarianism. Republicans say no, this is democracy.
That's right.
The administrative state is not going to rule this country if we get in power again.
Okay.
And so what happened at the end of the Obama administration, Jonathan, was that there were 35. I'll just use I think the number is about 3,500 political appointees that were shoved into civil service protected jobs throughout the administrative state, and Jonathan Tobin is exactly correct. It really undermined Trump at every turn. Everything he tried to do was undermined.
Okay.
So that's
so we're talking about a year. We're talking about potentially a year from now, January of 25, when a candidate Trump might become the next president and be inaugurated a year from now. Hopefully, we're not in an active state of war here, but that yet still is to be determined. I like to bring the conversation.
The question may be whether we'll be in an active state of war here in the United States if Trump wins.
Okay, well, okay.
Because I tremble for the Republic. I tremble for the Republic no matter who wins, because quite frankly, I'm not sure that either side will take it lying down, and certainly I see no signs that the Democrats will take it lying down if Trump wins. So we'll see what happens.
And in that respect, Trump's sort of bravado and everything, a lot of people on the right view him as almost a stand and a proxy, if you will, for what the left would do to us if they got power. And the lawfare, some of these ridiculous lawsuits, and I'm a lawyer, these are egregiously unfounded lawsuits that have been launched against Trump on many in criminal charges. And but they move forward with these, even as ridiculous as they are. And there is a concerted effort to create narratives that don't really comport with reality. And I agree with Jonathan 100% that I am concerned about civil war. And I can tell you that just traveling around and speaking at some different conferences, people they've had it. They've really had it. And so how does that play out? Well, and we see, in our major cities with the immigration thing that's going on, the life in major cities is just being destroyed.
I want to bring the conversation back to the war that is actually happening here.
Yes. Sure. Sorry for jumping ahead to a next possible war, but God forbid
we'll have you back.
We'll
have you back on November. I don't know what's the election day. The first Wednesday.
I think it's November 8th,
Monday of November.
And we have 360 days until the new administration.
There we go. So maybe maybe there's a Jewish thing in there with 360 being divisible by 18. We've been speaking about Michigan, right? Michigan has 15 electoral votes, and that makes it a swing state. Whether people are going to suddenly line up to vote for Trump in what's typically a blue state, or people don't show up, or they write in whomever. They write in Jonathan Tobin. Okay, well, whomever. But the point being is that those 15 electoral votes could swing the national election. So my question is, now we're in May, we're in June, we're approaching the party. Oh, I just lost the phrase. That's what you get when you're in Israel for 20 years. The not the caucuses.
Primaries.
No, not the primaries.
The conventions.
The conventions are coming up. Yeah.
The conventions, and so we're actively campaigning a Trump versus a Biden. What again? We're assuming we're still here in some kind of state of war, whether it's Hamas and Hezbollah or Iran. I don't know where it's going to go. What's it going to take for a Biden who's speaking out of both sides of his mouth, but has not yet cut off the arms? What's it going to take for Biden to have a Hail Mary and say, I'm not losing Michigan at any cost?
Well, the problem with that scenario And however much Biden is in control, or is aware of everything going on, we can debate about that. Um, he and his staff, he and his inner circle understand that if he does what his left wing wants him to do, what the sort of Arab American voters in Michigan, what the left wing voters in deep blue enclaves around the country want him to do, basically betrays Israel, cuts off the flow of arms, does something to really do damage and to sort of appease his left wing. That is not without political consequences in the United States, never mind what it would do to Israel, because centrist and moderate voters don't want him to betray Israel. Don't believe everything you read in the New York Times and the Washington Post or here on CNN and MSNBC. The vast majority of Americans, certainly almost all Republicans, but the vast majority of Americans still support Israel. Abandoning Israel to its, to face enemies on its own would be deeply unpopular. It would cause more trouble. I mean, as much as he rightly worries about his activist base, their lack of enthusiasm. There's a general lack of enthusiasm for him throughout most Democratic voters because he's been deep underwater in terms of popularity and effectiveness. But it would cost him dearly. And perhaps that is why, as well as any lingering sort of principle, I mean, he's always been someone who has said that he loves Israel, although in practice that usually meant he loves Israel whenever Israel does what he tells it to do, both dating back to when he was a senator to today. If he were to betray that, that would not be good politics. And that's part of the reason why he won't do it. So after October 7th, I was wondering, and indeed wondering in print, how long will Biden stay the course? Well, after 110 days, it's almost too late for him to turn back because the damage has already been done. And if he were to betray Israel now, the consequences politically would be as great, if not greater, than any damage his left wing can do to him.
So let me just pick another state. Florida has a large Jewish population. Would Florida revolt?
He's not going to go. He's not going to win Florida.
He's not going to win Florida anyway. Okay.
Florida's a red state now.
Okay.
And the Jews there are increasingly Republican.
Okay.
That it's not just Ron DeSantis, and not just all the talk about the free state of Florida because they had different COVID experiences. Although that is part of the reason why they've expanded their population incredibly. Florida is not in play.
Is there another state that's in play when you're talking about
where the Jewish vote might have a small role?
Because
I can give you one.
Evangelical Christians are not voting for Biden probably anyway. So
right.
So where is the
There's one state. It's where I'm sitting right now.
Where
Pennsylvania.
Are you sitting?
Pennsylvania is a state where the Jewish community would be, where Jewish Democrats would be influenced against Biden for that. And we have the interesting example of our junior senator, John Fetterman, who was reviled for basically being unqualified and having suffered a stroke and not being seemingly unable to do his job. But as he's regained his faculties, he's gone way to the center on lots of issues, not the least of which is his open support for Israel. And he would get, he would be among the people bashing Biden. So yeah, I mean, quite frankly, Biden's in trouble in Pennsylvania, as he is in every swing state throughout, Rust Belt. He's in deep trouble across the board in his polls, in state by state, nationally. Democrats are right to worry. We're a long way. There's no reason for any Trump, triumphalism. Who knows what will happen between now and then? Some black swan event, some anything. But he is in trouble in Pennsylvania, and as a centrist state, as a state that is still purple, where it could go either way. I think he would lose both working class and sort of Christian voters as well as Jewish voters. So yeah, Pennsylvania is a state that he could lose by betraying Israel.
Okay, John, you want to chime in on that?
Well, yeah,
I
I
mean,
live in
particularly,
Ohio, and
okay,
Ohio has
also,
been kind of bounced back and forth, and I'm not sure what's going to happen in Ohio. I mean, we have you know two-thirds majority, over two-thirds, 70% majorities in both houses of our state legislature, Republican governor, sort of a Republican governor, and but it's changing. The thing that I mentioned immigration, I don't want to focus on that, but I think if Trump can tie the concerns about immigration to Israel's problems, that I think is a big winning issue, because the immigration thing is just so out of control. And if there is, as Jonathan mentioned, a black swan event or a terrorist attack or something like that, that will be a complete, in my view, a game changer that would cement support for Trump, and even bring people from the Democratic Party, the center, and the independents over towards the Trump camp. Whether they like Trump or not, they don't like what Biden has allowed to happen. So it would only take one or two of those events that.
what am I missing, John? Talking about you're comparing Israel's situation with the
Well, it
immigration,
would be
other than the fact that our border was impeached.
well, but the terrorism that would come with the ideology that's attacking Israel right now. If an attack happens in the United States of the same ideology, Muslim ideology,
Okay.
for like Hamas. And that's a real concern. I mean, if you've seen these people coming over the border, the thousands every day, I just think that Trump could tie that. But look at what Israel didn't take the threat seriously, and they ended up in this problem. We're not going to allow that here, and we're going to help out our friends Israel through this time, because we're facing it ourselves. And this is how it's going to be dealt with, as a sort of as a matter of strength, a show of strength.
Okay.
If I can just jump in on that for a moment. Democrats tend to downplay immigration as an issue, and they poo-poo. They say it's just, if they were to hear what John just said about the threat of terrorism because of the porous border, they would say, "Oh, you're an alarmist, you're crazy, whatever." I don't know that there is going, although there certainly have been instances. Trump has spoken about it, and people on the left, their heads blow up when he says it. I don't know that there's going to be, God forbid, a terrorist incident because of the porous border. But people on the left and Democrats vastly underestimate, indeed, people abroad vastly underestimate the importance of the immigration issue in this election. The spectacle of an open border, of millions of illegal immigrants pouring into this country since Biden became president. The population of New York has arrived here since he was elected.
Wow.
And the humanitarian crisis it created in border communities, and now in urban centers in the Northeast and elsewhere in Chicago, as the immigrants arrive there, whether bused there by Republican governors or going there on their own. It's an enormous problem, and people who look on from abroad, in the United States, don't understand how serious this issue is and what a real problem it is for Biden. He's only belatedly started to wake up to it, and even so, I don't think he really has any conception of how to stem. To deal with it, because ideologically the Democrats are, quite frankly, an open borders party right now.
Is that like, yeah, go ahead,
Jonathan, when I hear friends of mine telling story after story, that they're flying back through Tucson or Phoenix or LA, and two-thirds of the flights are full of immigrants that have no names on their papers, that go through security unchecked and that type of thing. And nobody knows where they go after they land. I mean, it's hard to wrap my head around what is actually happening here. So I think some way to tie the issue with Israel, security and border and sanctity of their border, to what's going on in the United States, I think is a way for Trump to maybe to push the issue forward. It is a huge issue.
That's true, but let me just, let's put this in perspective. I think, John and I both agree about this. This election is not going to be won or lost on Israel, except perhaps, with Biden losing some of the, the enthusiasm of his own party. It's going to be won or lost on domestic issues. It's as is almost always the case in the case
Okay.
other than if there was war. So people who care about Israel, we're always, I count myself, we're always looking for how is Israel impacting this. Um, you know, this is not going to, Biden's support for Israel is not going to cost him, is not going to win him the election. It probably wouldn't cost him the election if everything else were equal. It certainly is an indication of the tension within the Democratic Party that is part of his broader
So,
problem.
Jonathan, let me ask you, it's 70%, typically 80% of American Jews vote the Democratic Party. If
That's 70.
Biden be 70, okay, so if Biden were to somehow betray Israel, cut off weapons, push the two-state solution, try to enforce a ceasefire, not abstain from a UN Security Council resolution, or some other such thing, will Biden lose support significantly of American Jews, and will that matter?
No,
Okay.
no, and no.
Okay.
That sounds counterintuitive for somebody who cares about Israel, but let's be honest. Jewish Democrats are not voting for Trump. The overwhelming majority of them are not voting for Trump, not if Joe Biden, declares war on it, short of, and even if he declared war on Israel, they wouldn't vote for Trump. Most American Jews, the Jews who vote for the Democrats, who are overwhelmingly liberal, and that's anywhere from 60 to 70, 75, depending on the circumstance, percent of the Jewish electorate. Israel isn't a litmus test issue for them. Israel is a litmus test issue for the 25 to 38 to 35% of Jews who vote for the Republicans, whether they're because they are Orthodox and therefore more likely to care more deeply about Israel, or because they're politically conservative and they identify more with Israel. So if you're, the basement for Biden's Jewish support is probably 55, 60%, no matter what he did. Now, a few votes here and there, it could, a few thousand votes could cost him, Pennsylvania, which may be the only state where there's a sizable Jewish population which is truly a battleground state. I don't think Florida is a battleground state anymore. Despite John's sort of pessimism about the Republicans, I'm not sure that Ohio is really either. It's a pretty red state. So, the Jews are going to vote for the Democrats no matter what they do. It's a source of great frustration for Republicans, especially for Jewish Republicans who have been chasing after that magic, that the silver bullet that's going to somehow wake Jews up to vote their interests. Trump himself is, very frustrated about it when you push that button. He starts talking about, why are they voting against me? I'm the most pro-Israel person. They're voting against Israel. They vote because they're liberals. Because they're politically liberals and they're Democrats. And political liberals and Democrats hate Trump. They hate Republicans in general. They wouldn't vote for Nikki Haley either, let's be honest, or anybody else. You can name them. Even people like DeSantis or Haley who have really strong records on Israel and who have strong bases of, a lot of Jewish supporters. So the Jewish vote is, it's a perennial topic for the Jewish press, but it's never really in play, not that much.
And the Jews, and if Jews were to stay home and not vote for Biden, as is concerned about in Michigan with the Arabs, there's not a state in which that makes an influence, because New York and New Jersey and California are going to be Democratic anyway.
Yeah, listen, if Jews are staying home out of disillusionment with Biden, it's because they're left wingers and they don't like, and they think Biden is not left wing enough. If that's happening, then his ship is sinking, regardless of what's going on with Israel.
All right, John, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, I just think that the Republicans need to push the narrative about what the Biden administration is actually doing vis-a-vis Israel. I just think that that's a good issue for them. Now that it's coming from somebody who supports Israel, is very concerned about what's going on. But the ultimate bottom line here is this is an incredibly divided country right now. And it's almost 50-50 in many of the states. it's relatively shocking. I mean, we had a recent ballot issue that used to be a Republican winner issue. And in my county, which is a red county, 67% voted not the traditional Republican way in an election just 2 months ago. So I'm a little bit pessimistic, but I think Ohio will hang in there. A lot of it depends on how many votes they're able to bring out of all the blue areas of Ohio. I mean, when we talk about the division of America, we talk about blue and red, and the blue is usually either on the coast or in urban areas in the center. That's where most of it comes from. So it's a very interesting division. But you get outside of the urban areas, and it's pretty much a red country.
So let me ask you a question. In addition to the president, everyone's got their eyes on the White House and who's going to be sitting there literally a year from now. We also have a third of the Senate, all of the House, and I don't know how many governors up for re-election. How, if at all, does Israel play in any of those elections we're talking about in the districts in these divided states that you're referring to, John?
I would say, in most, the way the districts have been created, they're pretty much, I would say, I don't know, Jonathan, maybe disagree. 80% of them are safe seats for either a Democrat or Republican.
That might be a little conservative.
Okay, I wanted to say 90%.
Although I should say there are more competitive seats than perhaps there were several years ago. Reapportionment has changed that. There'll be another round of reapportionment because of lawsuits in places like New York, which will make perhaps less competitive seats. But you're right. I mean, Congress is very evenly divided. We are in a bifurcated political culture in this country. Israel is a little bit like that too, of course, Jonathan, right? We live in
two parties always at odds with each other.
Yeah, it's not just the two parties. We are divided, certainly in this country, by, we watch, listen, read completely different sets of media.
Correct.
And we are further isolated because most people don't, get their news from social media. And social media, you can basically live in a silo and isolate yourselves completely from differing opinions. So that's why most people are sort of angry when confronted by a differing opinion because they're not used to it anymore. That said, listen, Congress, the congressional election, Republicans seem to be are more in trouble in terms of the House. They have a very narrow majority. It's not clear how that's going to play out. There are individual districts where there will be interesting races, sometimes more within primaries. In New York, Jamal Bowman, one of the newer members of the Squad, who was a vicious anti-Israel character. Summer Lee in Pittsburgh, another Democratic, anti-Israel guy. They're facing, real primary challenges, real general election challenges. Ilhan Omar, her seat is not as safe as it might be. And she's certainly facing a very difficult primary challenge from Democrats who don't want such a radical representing them. So there are lots of individual, especially where you have anti-Israel radicals up. But Israel is not going to, the congressional elections aren't going to be influenced by what's happening in Israel. They will be more influenced by what happens at the top of the ticket. Certainly, if this turns out to be either a big Republican or a big Democratic year, and right now we're sitting in January, the meters, the arrows pointing more towards the Republicans right now. The polls are in Trump's favor. His voters are pretty much united behind him, Nikki Haley's continuing candidacy notwithstanding. And Democrat, there's a distinct lack of enthusiasm for Joe Biden. Who knows what will happen between now and November? But the top of the ticket will certainly influence a lot of these races. And that's what's going to determine. Also, individual, politics is always it's not about theoretical candidates versus other theoretical candidates. It's about who's running.
Right.
It's a very good Senate map for Republicans this year. But if they put up a bunch of loser candidates the way they did in 2022, then, they'll lose.
Okay. So well, I want to begin to wrap it up. This is fabulous. We could go on for a while. Maybe we'll revisit this in a couple of months and see what's going on. Maybe the war will be done here more or less.
That would be nice.
It would be nice. I'm not so sure. They say my
Well,
son.
a good outcome, shall we say, better than the war be over.
Well, but there are many fronts on the war, and I'll
Yeah.
tell you, having been on the Lebanese border this week, handing out winter jackets to soldiers from our Israel emergency campaign, I will tell you, not a single soldier I spoke to isn't ready, willing, and able to go into Lebanon because they understand that we have 100,000 people on the northern border who can't live in their homes, and we
Mhm.
can't live our lives with Hezbollah controlling the destiny, and they're ready. But this actually leads to the question, and there's some questions that are live now, and some people said, how does Israel? Let's say Biden continues, maybe not doubles down, but continues to go a little more stringent with or without withholding weapons, and that would be a big one. How does Israel withstand that pressure in an electoral season, both in the United States and almost inevitably that we're going to have an election here in Israel this year as well? What is and how does that retroactively impact U.S. politics, if at all?
Well, I think, as difficult as Benjamin Netanyahu's political situation is, and it really couldn't be any more difficult, he has shown in the past a willingness to say no to the Americans. And if there is any time that he's going to have to say no, it's when this literally the security, the existential fate of his country is up for grabs. He is not going to. I cannot imagine a scenario under which he will accede to American pressure to allow Hamas to continue in Gaza, or in the end, to accept a situation in the north of the country where, as you say, 100,000, there were hundreds of thousands of refugees in the south and 100,000 Jewish refugees in the north. In the long run, that's not a situation that he or any Israeli prime minister can accept. And whoever is in charge of the Israeli government will have to do what is in Israel's interest. And it's true. The American president, the administration could cut off arms flow. At this point, I'm not pessimistic about that happening, as I might have been a few months ago. But even if they did, Israel will do what it has to do to defend itself. And I would imagine the vast majority of the American people will support its right to defend itself and go on. And again, as I said before, there are more votes to be lost for Biden by betraying Israel than by sticking with it. And again, as much as the American election is not going to be decided by Israel, that would give an opening to Trump to just drive right through because he has the bona fides on Israel now. Whether or not that will win him a single more extra Jewish vote, I expect Israel to do what it has to do and to continue to do that, regardless of what Biden says. And Biden's, incoherent leadership and, sort of ambivalence about things just makes it, quite frankly, easier for them to do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
John?
I would agree. Look, I think it's going to be a close, crazy, we always say unprecedented elections, but this I think is unprecedented because of the issues that are hitting everybody. And there are huge cultural issues in the United States that, we look at what's going on at our major universities with the anti-Israel protest. That's not going to turn around in 9 months before the election, at least with regard to the people that have adopted that. And so I'm concerned that I sort of view extreme views of sort of a horseshoe that sort of meet at a point. And so you have the anti-Israel, anti-war, isolationist on the right, and you also have the same things and the left, and they eventually merge. But I will tell you, I've been very shocked about people on the conservative side, some of them who seem to be allies on issues that conservatives like, with the COVID and the lockdowns and that type of thing. There was a lot of division on that. But now some of those people have turned against Israel in a way that is just absolutely shocking to me. Israel only went into Gaza, one narrative is because they want to build the Ben Gurion Canal, and that's not going to happen. I mean, there's the cost and logistics of that. If you look at how they proposed doing that back in the '60s, it's a ridiculous thing, but it gets so much traction on the extreme edges. And so when I open my Twitter feed, it is a sewer of Jew hatred and anti-Israel screeds. It's just, maybe I need to learn how to manage my social media better, but it's unbelievable the things that I see. And so maybe that magnifies the extreme voices beyond what they really are. But I'm concerned that, particularly on the conservative side, that there's a lot of people who are buying into these narratives.
Okay, John, thank you for that. Gentlemen, I want to leave an open-ended question for either of you, both of you, as we conclude. It's a very broad topic. I think we've concluded that, okay, Americans don't vote largely based on foreign policy, that Donald Trump and Joe Biden, barring a cataclysmic event, whether it's legal or with their actual existence being alive, will be the candidates, and who their vice presidents will be a separate interesting topic. But what else could go down in the coming months that will influence Israel's ability to carry out the war and influence the election that we haven't yet discussed?
Wow. It's a wide world full of terrible things that can always happen.
Well, give me a good one. I don't know.
Listen, I'm not going to play the black swan game.
Okay.
It's like that's if my mother, blessed memory, would say that that's bad luck, and that's not a good thing to do, to think of horrible things, because then you'll make them happen. I don't know. I would say this. Um, there is any number of sort of bad things. I assume Iran and its terrorist allies are doing their worst at all times to make the world a terrible place. And as we saw on October 7th of last year, sometimes they're able to do that. I can't think of anything much worse than that. But I think the things that will influence this election, if I can sort of ground it in what is, for me, the real issue, the most important issue that we don't talk about enough as much as it does get talked about. And it is this broader element of, this battle for Western civilization and the long march of progressives and their woke ideology of intersectionality and the diversity, equity, and inclusion woke catechism that they have imposed throughout academia, the corporate world, and now the government, thanks to Joe Biden. If you were to ask me, what is the worst thing that Joe Biden did as president? I would easily answer, as much as, I talked about his foreign policy disasters and all that, and I would have criticisms of other things. It is his executive orders that put in place DEI committees and then woke commissars throughout the federal government, every agency and department. That is the real threat to Jews in this country. And by extension, that is a threat to Israel and a threat to America in general. And sometimes a lot of liberal Jews have woken up since October 7th to the threat from DEI. The three university presidents' testimony certainly brought it to in December, brought it to the front. But it's much bigger than the fate of those three individuals. It's about the fate of basically of Western civilization. And it's not just bad for Jews. Jews in this case are the canaries in the coal mine. The real threat is to America itself. And that to me, it's the issue I keep going back to. So I've, used your open-ended question to do that.
Oh, good.
That is the key question facing this country. Not so much which, elderly white gentleman will be sworn in as president next year, but whether this terrible ideology, which is taking a terrible toll on a racial harmony in this country, it's empowering and granting a permission slip for anti-Semitism, whether we will start to roll back the tide on that. And that to me is the most, as much as obviously the safety and security of Israel is, uppermost in my mind at all times, that to me, DEI and the rolling back the woke tide is the most important question facing Americans.
Thank you, Jonathan. John?
I would agree with that almost virtually 100%. I would just add too that I agree that Jewish people are the canary in the coal mine on a lot of these policies, but conservative Christians are right behind them because we feel a real threat. And, I faced it when I was still actively practicing law. It came to the forefront in many places. So we have had 100 years of a long, is what's called a long march through the institutions to set in place these various ideals that are now manifesting themselves through ESG and DEI and that type of thing. I just think that we're, whether you like the New Yorker magazine or not, they were talking last week about 10 conflicts in the Middle East that are converging possibly into a wider war. And I think that's the concern. Of course, we have China, we have Russia causing problems in a lot of places. Iran is causing things. And I sit here as I'm looking at the news, I see Iran and Raisi and Erdogan from Turkey are meeting today. And it's bothering me that Erdogan's been pretty quiet for the last 3 months. That makes me very, very nervous, given his orientation. So I just think that there are so many different places in the world that can develop into a flashpoint. There are so many conflicts in so many places and geopolitical competition. And then you have these loons on the left that are shutting down energy and hydrocarbons. Like this is going to be it's absolute insanity. They think that they're going to make the world better that way. It's, and so we just had a display of that at Davos last week. And Jamie Dimon, I would recommend you go dig Jamie Dimon's interview out at CNBC. And I'm not necessarily a fan of Mr. Dimon, but he had very good comments about, you people on the left, you Democrats, you need to understand that these are real people that you're complaining about, and they're not that bad. And a lot of heads exploded. Some people said maybe Jamie Dimon should run for president. And my immediate comment was, I don't think he's old enough. And, he still has all of his faculties about him. So I don't know if Biden's going to make it all the way to the election. This is something that we've never seen before. But there's an inertia in DC that is pushing forward these agendas. And so it's up to Trump, assuming he's the candidate, to kind of stand up against them.
Excellent. John Howard, Jonathan Tobin, what an engaging conversation. There were many, many questions that we didn't answer directly. I tried to weave into the course of conversation, some not related to the specific issue, but really important topics. And I do want to ask everybody to be in touch, to email the questions. I hope I'll be able to save them as a file and we can address them, and maybe with the two of you gentlemen and or others in the coming months to unpack this. But our point, and I think John, how you began to wrap up your points in terms of conservative Christians being right behind Jews in terms of being at risk, if you will, in the United States, is an important emphasis on how we what we're doing with Genesis 1-2-3 Foundation. And I want to encourage people to stay with us and continue to engage. At this point, I'm inviting Arlene Samuels. Hopefully I can invite her to come on board. We're going to close out. Yep, here she goes. We're going to close out with a couple of announcements, and Arlene's going to close with prayer. Let me see if I can make you a co-host, Arlene, and that way we can see you as well. And again, John and Jonathan, extraordinary. Thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Arlene, we see you.
Hello, Jonathan. Jonathan, it's such a pleasure to be with such a distinguished trio, and I am really delighted to talk for a few minutes about your wonderful initiative to provide jackets for the Israel Defense Forces who are already up on the northern border and certainly preparing for the next steps to fight the evil doing that is taking place against Israel. Our Sunday school class at my church, I let them know about this wonderful issue that the Genesis 123 Foundation began, and they joined in and purchased some of the jackets, and it was wonderful to read about your delivering them. And I, of course, sent it to the other members of our Sunday school class, and there are others that my husband and I contacted to let them know about your wonderful initiative.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, and I hope that everyone will continue to purchase these jackets, because that border may be cold,
Oh dear.
but militarily getting hot, and we better make sure that these brave, courageous young IDF soldiers are warm.
Thank you, Arlene. Thank you. I appreciate those words. Would you like to close us out in a prayer that's fitting? I neglected to mention that Arlene is not only a good friend, a colleague, a tremendously talented writer, and goodness, among Christian Zionists, there's no one stronger.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's my privilege to end this wonderful session with prayer. God, our Father, I thank you for the strong ties that bind Jews and Christians together on behalf of the people and land that you created to bless our world. God, for us as Christians, it is a privilege to stand with Israel. It is our spiritual homeland to stand with Israel and your people, the Jews. We continue to ask for your mercies upon the hostages and their families, the courageous humanitarian Israel Defense Forces. We ask for you to provide your wisdom for Prime Minister Netanyahu, Israel's military leaders, and of course, all the IDF and all of Israel. May Israel remain unified. Lord, may you also silence the Jew-hating voices and raise up massive numbers of us in the Christian and Jewish community to spread the facts about who Israel is, your land, your creation, your wonderful people, and that you are never going to let go of Israel. We thank you for your love and your sovereignty, and you to continue to strengthen all of us to oppose evil. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. Thank you, everyone, for participating. John and Jonathan, again, thank you for your insight, your time, and we'll pray for good things in the future and inspiring conversations. God bless you all.